A short guide to three-dimensional drawing. I'm not sure that the title, three-dimensional drawing, really describes what we're up to in this video, but allow me to lay out some of the big ideas and then we'll discuss it. So I like to start with this drawing by Michelangelo, which is just one of my favorite drawings of all time. And I was looking at this drawing when I was in graduate school back in 1998, 1999. And what struck me about this drawing is that while there is kind of a light source, what Michelangelo was doing is he's planning a painting. And this is one of the figures in the Sistine ceiling. And while he's planning a painting, he's thinking like a sculptor. And what I mean by that is that he's building this image, and he's working it up from a single angle because that's ultimately what the painting is going to be. But he doesn't seem to be thinking about the figure as a static sort of form. He's thinking about the figure as a form in space. And the resulting drawing is just completely different from the kind of drawing that you see from literally everybody else at the time, which is the Italian Renaissance, but also for the most part since, because it's a convention to rely on light in order to render something. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to discuss it, but a good way to start discussing it is to think about drawing in terms of how are we going to simplify something. And we'll go through a few different things, then we'll come back. But this, like, what's the simplest way to break information down in drawing terms? It's to break it down into lines, right? So if we look at like a perspective drawing where the 1 or 2 point perspective is correct, we have something that we know is going to be easy to read from the viewer. The viewer understands the space, they understand the angles, they understand their place in it, all of that good stuff. But ultimately that starts out and finishes relatively static. So there's got to be more depth to it. And then if we look at this 2 point perspective drawing by Walter Gropius, this was an architectural drawing, a proposal for the Chicago Tribune building in Chicago. And it kind of functions in a lot of ways the same way that the Michelangelo drawing does. It doesn't rely real heavily on light. There are some cast shadows, and there are some indications that the light is coming in from the left. But for the most part, it's a great drawing that really focuses the viewer on the structure of the building. But again, it's the structure of a building. It doesn't have a lot of potential. I mean, the potential is in the way that the drawing is thought about. There's not a lot of aesthetic potential in exactly the way this is presented. And if we keep thinking along these lines, we can go down some sort of avenues that are maybe kind of interesting, but might get us off track. And in the interest of getting off track, there's a sort of a mode of mark making that you're going to find a lot in, like let's say if you take a 2D design class, if you're a college student or a high school student, you might run into this type of mark making. So we have these like indentions in this drawing, and then we have like half of them are indentions, half of them are cones, and we're just using a single line to sort of probe the surface, describe the light, but describe the form in particular. And there's a lot of potential here too. This is a rabbit hole that you can go down that can be really, really interesting. but it's also super flat no matter what you do. And when we move into the J. Seeley piece, this is kind of a famous image that if you just like close your eyes and open a 2D design textbook, you'll probably run into this drawing. It's extremely flat, but it shows you how much potential a single line can have. And we just take, with the fabric, we just take one of these lines in the fabric, and the repetition of the nuances in individual lines, when those things all line up together, they give us an unbelievable amount of information. And that ought to, if you're a drawing person, and if you're watching this video, you are, that should spark your interest. There's so much potential here. It's not the avenue I want to go down in terms of talking about it, because this isn't really the way I think or the way I draw, but I wanted to make sure that people knew that this was out there. And when we go over to Mark Summers, we're just on a completely different level. He's taking the thinking from the last two drawings and just making it into something profound. And like, just for instance, this is a portrait of John Calvin of Calvinist fame. And if you go into his face and you just take one of those basically horizontal lines that run right through his face, and you just follow one of those lines and look at how it just, the minute changes in that line are what gives us an unbelievable amount of information. We go from the cheek to the front of his face, the plane changes, the front of his cheek, through the nose, through the front of the nose, wrapping around, all of this. He does all of it without even changing direction. And this is the kind of sort of organizational line work that I'm talking about at absolutely the highest level. And these things all apply directly to everything we're going to be talking about as the video progresses. And I want to move back to the Libyan Sibyl. That's the title of the Michelangelo drawing. And I want to point out about the Michelangelo drawing that just one of the wonderful things about it, and about the idea that we're discussing here, is that trying to render something sort of in the round, three-dimensionally, I suppose, to go back to the title of the video, without relying on the light source that the viewer expects, it sort of sets up your intentions outside the confines of what the viewer is going to be expecting. And there's a lot of power in that. One of the first things that you have to do when you're trying to make art is figure out what your intentions are and how you're going to compare that to what the viewer's expectations are. And if you can balance those things and really give the viewer even things that they didn't think they wanted, but, sort of make sure that they're happy with what you've given them, there's a lot there. What I want to do is go back to the Libyan Sibyl and point out that the figure here is a volume that's not just drawn in space. It's kind of like if you're trying to draw a cube using only lines. You can, in almost any case, you can draw the cube showing the three planes that are facing you, but the viewer understands that there are 6 planes and there are 3 planes we can't see. I look at this drawing and I kind of feel like Michelangelo is doing that. He's not thinking about the figure as a 2-dimensional image. He's thinking about it completely in the round. And that's one of the really cool things about it. And then once you realize that, then you start looking at the individual masses in the drawing, and you can start to see where he's kind of making anatomy up and sort of taking liberties and and kind of playing around with the sort of graphic potential of the way he's thinking about it. And if we start looking at some different examples, we can look at this Edgar Degas drawing, where it seems really obvious to me that he's looking at the Libyan Sibyl pretty much the same way I am. And Degas seems to go after it in much the same way. He doesn't. There's a light source. It's on the left and it's coming in and moving to the right. But he doesn't really give us any cast shadows aside from the one that is on the sheet on the right. But the way that the form is handled doesn't really rely very heavily on the presence of the light source at all. He's interested more in these hatch lines and these volumes that he's creating. And it's just such a rich drawing. I wanted to throw that one in there. The next group of drawings are going to be drawings that I made. And since I'm the one who made them, I'm in a unique position to discuss them. So this is my attempt at addressing a lot of the big ideas that are found in the Libyan Sibyl. The drawing isn't devoid of a light source. It uses one. And in order to try to make a connection to the Libyan Sibyl, I tried to use as many of whatever conventions Michelangelo was making use of. I allowed myself to do that. I also did this in a figure drawing class, so I needed to make sure that the other people in the room were happy with the lighting. So the lighting does play a role here. But what I want to point out is that in the drawing, I was trying to make sure that I dealt with the information in a way that downplayed the light and played up the structure. I wanted the viewer to understand that looking at the figure's back, that the way that I drew it, perhaps the way that I handled the edges and the way that the form sort of wraps around, I wanted to give the impression that the front was also there. And I realized at the same time that there's bigger ideas at play here that the conventions I'm using don't really let me get there. So as good as I think the drawing is, it fails in certain ways. But the next drawing, I think, is probably a little more pure in terms of our discussion. And the next drawing brings up the sort of the larger problem of abstraction that plays a big role in painting and drawing. But this drawing itself, it doesn't have a light source that's directional anyway. I think it's probably wise at this point to point out that if you're drawing, you have to have a light source. Don't think that I'm saying that you should draw in the dark. There's always someone out there that will take that away. But what was going on in this drawing is I decided that in order to keep my intentions sort of pure, as far as the larger sort of abstraction of this thing, is that every mark that I made would become a line that would touch both ends of the paper. So every single line you see in the drawing, whether it was the lines I used to block in the major shapes, or if I was just trying to work out like a really tiny plane change just above one of the armpits, it didn't matter. The line went from one end of the page to the other, and I allowed myself to vary the weight of the line so I could give it priority in certain places, and that way you would start to see the drawing develop. And drawing like this is kind of tricky at the beginning because you totally can't tell what anything is, and you really have to be paying attention. And I think I gave myself some options to make little notes, like little dots, marks, X's, whatever. I think if you inspect the drawing, you'll find those things. But what I ended up accomplishing was producing a figure where the means of communication are basically the same means of communication you would use if you were trying to draw a cube. It's just that the masses end up being way more information oriented when you're drawing a figure as opposed to something as simple as three visible planes and then three planes that you don't see. But I want to bring in and explain some of the concepts behind cubism here, because the larger problem of abstraction in painting and drawing, we're starting to get down to it here. So um, the image that I have is by Jacques Villon, and he was not necessarily 100% a cubist artist, but his version of cubism is like accessible. We can look at it without laughing, which a lot of cubism is just laughably bad. And it would be fun to do a whole discussion on that. But this drawing in particular, I think, is a nice accessible version of cubism, where the idea behind cubism was to represent the three-dimensional world in two dimensions by sort of drawing every view of what you're trying to show the viewer, including every point of view in one image. Now, one of the fundamental starting points of drawing, the way that we typically discuss it, understand it, and do it, is that there's a single point of view that the drawing is made from. And then once you've established that single point of view, you can then render things in a realistic manner. And Cubism attempts to solve that problem by breaking one of the fundamental rules. And so Cubism turns into a whole bunch of different possible avenues, and a lot of them are just embarrassing. But there are a few of them that are really interesting, and ultimately the solution to the problem that I'm laying out in this discussion may end up being one of those sort of cubistic roots that naturally kind of spring from the basic assumptions we make about drawing. And one could look at the drawing of mine that I'm talking about at the moment, with all these lines and intersections, and start to extrapolate that maybe we could turn around the form and start to show more of that. And maybe that's where ultimately it goes. But I'm still trying to get drawing to function inside the basic, like, fundamental structures that make realistic or representational artwork. Antonio Lopez Garcia is next up, and he's kind of known as a draftsman who's like really, really patient. That shows up in all his work, and it's one of the hallmarks. He's one of those contemporary artists that's actually willing to spend time with things rather than rushing. This drawing is a little bit different. I mean, it has all the hallmarks of what makes his work really good, but there's a rushed quality to it that isn't bad. Normally, that's kind of a bad thing. But in this case, I believe he's drawing someone who is deceased, and he obviously doesn't have probably a lot of time with them. So he's got to sort of record what he wants to record as quickly as he can. And what he ends up doing with this drawing, I mean, there's a light source. I mean, there always is. But the light source plays very, very little role. He allows slightly darker edges on his planes that move away to the left. But it seems like primarily what he's up to is he seems like he's trying to draw the person's skull, but there's skin in the way. And so how does he deal with the skin? He just like draws it in a way that's like really tight and just pressed up against the structure that is the skull, and you can really see it around the mouth, where you can see his where the teeth are on the right. You can see his cheeks just sort of push way in, and the cheekbone kind of sticks up a little bit. And The drawing is really worth looking at as up close as you can get, because there's so many awesome little details where he differentiates between two tiny little planes on his on the model's lip, or on the side of the eye where the eye orbital sort of opening moves into the cheekbone. There's so many little details like that that are wonderful, but he never loses sight of the structure of the head. And there's really interesting solutions to a lot of the problems we've laid out today in this drawing. It's a matter of grabbing one or two of them and then taking them for a ride. And the last drawing I wanted to talk about is this drawing by Rubens. And Rubens always seems to me to be in a rush. It's rare in his work where he isn't. And if Rubens is in a rush, it's because he's doing commissions, he's always got a deadline. And he paints and draws in that way. And you can look up some of his other work and you'll see what I mean. But when he draws his wife, he is in a completely different place. And there's a painting that this drawing is a study for. The painting is at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and it is just a marvel. It's one of the best portraits that I've ever come across, and the opportunity to look at it in person was just a real gift. But the drawing, well, and the painting, he treats them differently than his other work. And it has to be because of the relationship, the special relationship he has with his wife that he has obviously with no one else. And when we start looking at this drawing, he uses two different colors of chalk. Or let's say he uses red chalk, he uses charcoal more than likely, and then he has a third, he has a white, something he's using as a highlight. It's probably a white Conti or a white chalk. And the red chalk he uses to draw all the curves and to do a lot of the modeling that doesn't have to do with the light source. It's really interesting to me in this drawing how he takes the information that's tied to light and he uses one material for it, and he has another material that he uses for information that isn't tied to light. So the red chalk, if you look through the drawing, that's where he's kind of thinking out loud. He's thinking structurally. And then where the charcoal comes in, where the colors are cooler, that's where he's adding the shadow information. So when you go to a place in the drawing like her nose, where there's a little shadow under the nose, but for the most part the nose is just planes and structure, he really just lovingly takes his time and draws with the red chalk. And then when he gets to the cheek and to the neck, it's not as interesting, it's not as structural. Then he can come in with the charcoal. But what I wanted to leave you with, as far as this drawing goes and some of the bigger ideas, is that the way that Rubens decides to subdivide what material he's going to use according to what information he's trying to convey, he's also tying that in with the relationship that he has with his wife. And the work that he makes when he's drawing his wife is so much better than anything else in his body of work. It's just, Rubens is on another level compared to almost any human being, but within his body of work, the work he does on his wife is just even exponentially better than that. And I think that it comes from his desire to express that relationship, but also because he wants to do that, he seems to be engaging and thinking a lot more about the structures and the abstraction ultimately that the drawing is, so that he can communicate all of his ideas more fully. And ultimately, I mean, that's kind of what we're all going after when it comes down to this drawing stuff. So what I'm hoping this video did was lay out a series of possibilities for the viewer. I understand that we didn't come to any conclusions. The video was about allowing yourself to think unconventionally and find a way to communicate through drawing that works for you and helps you to make better work.